I miss the boy you used to be, my mother whispered from her hospital bed, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had ever heard. My name is Helen Carter, and at 72 years old, I never imagined those words would become the beginning of the end for my family. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and fresh linens. Afternoon sunlight slipped through the blinds in thin golden stripes, stretching across the pale floor and climbing the edge of the blanket folded neatly over my lap. My son Ryan stood only a few feet away, frozen in place. For a moment, he looked like a frightened little boy again. Then the expression vanished. Behind him stood his wife, Vanessa, perfectly composed as always, her arms crossed lightly over her designer jacket. Anyone looking at her would have thought she was concerned. I knew better. The doctor had left only minutes earlier, assuring everyone that I would recover well with rest and time. Rest and time. Funny how those two things become precious when you realize how much of your life has already passed. Ryan took a cautious step toward me. "Mom," he said softly, "I'm right here." I turned my face toward the window instead of toward him. Outside, a maple tree swayed gently in the October breeze. Its leaves were turning red and gold, preparing to let go. "No," I replied quietly. "The boy I knew isn't." Vanessa shifted beside him. I heard the faint sound of her sigh. Ryan looked wounded, but wounds have a history. They do not appear out of nowhere. For 3 years I had watched my son become someone I barely recognized. The transformation happened slowly enough that I kept making excuses. He was busy. He was stressed. Marriage required compromise. Success changed schedules. I repeated those explanations so often that eventually I almost believed them. Yet every missed phone call, every forgotten birthday, every family dinner canceled at the last minute stacked itself quietly beside the others. Small disappointments rarely arrive alone. They travel in groups. Ryan opened his mouth as if he wanted to argue, then closed it again. For once, there was nothing he could say. The truth has a way of exhausting every excuse. Vanessa touched his arm. "Maybe we should let your mother rest," she said. Her voice was calm, polished, perfectly measured. It was the same voice she used whenever she wanted to sound reasonable. Ryan nodded slowly. Before leaving, he looked back one last time. The hurt in his eyes might have moved me once. Years ago, I would have reached for his hand. Years ago, I would have told him everything was going to be okay. But as the door closed behind them, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not sadness, relief. Because after years of pretending not to see what was happening, I had finally stopped lying to myself. And what neither Ryan nor Vanessa understood was that the story they believed had started in this hospital room had actually begun 6 months earlier, on the night I accidentally overheard a conversation that changed everything. 6 months earlier, I stood in my kitchen rinsing a coffee mug when I heard Ryan and Vanessa talking on the back patio. The sliding glass door was cracked open just enough for their voices to drift inside with the warm spring air. I was not trying to listen. In fact, I almost walked away. But then I heard my name. That is the strange thing about growing older. You learn when silence is safer than questions. I turned off the faucet and remained perfectly still. Vanessa laughed softly. It was not a cruel laugh. That would have been easier to understand. It was the kind of laugh people use when discussing a problem they believe is already solved. "Once she moves," Vanessa said, "everything becomes simpler." Ryan did not answer immediately. I waited for him to disagree. I waited for him to defend me the way he used to when he was young. Instead, I heard the scrape of a chair and then his voice. "I know. Just 2 words. Quiet. Casual. Ordinary. Somehow they hurt more than anger ever could." I stared at the dishes drying beside the sink. A blue plate. A white bowl. A glass with a tiny chip near the rim. Suddenly, every object in that kitchen felt sharper. More real. More permanent than the life I thought I was living. "The assisted living place looked nice," Vanessa continued. "The rooms were bigger than I expected." Assisted living. The words settled into the room like dust. Nobody had spoken to me about assisted living. Nobody had asked what I wanted. Nobody had mentioned touring facilities. My heart began to beat faster, but I remained silent. Ryan exhaled heavily. "She is going to be upset." Vanessa replied immediately. "Only at first. Eventually she will understand it is for the best." For the best. People often use those words when making decisions for someone else. I finally stepped away from the sink and sat down at the kitchen table. Their voices became softer, harder to hear. But I had already heard enough. The conversation continued for several more minutes before the patio door opened, and they walked back inside. By then I was reading an old gardening magazine I had taken from the counter. Vanessa smiled when she saw me. Ryan kissed my cheek. Neither of them realized anything had changed. Neither of them knew that a wall had appeared where trust used to live. That evening, after they left, I walked through my house room by room. The living room, the guest room, the hallway lined with family photographs. Every picture told the same story. Birthday parties, school plays, Christmas mornings, little league games, vacations at the lake. Decades of memories carefully framed and hung on the walls. I stopped in front of a photograph of Ryan at age 10. He was missing his front tooth and holding a fishing pole twice his size. His smile was pure joy. Looking at that picture, I realized something painful. The son in that frame would never have discussed my future without me sitting at the table. And for the first time, I began to wonder how long it had been since that boy disappeared. After that evening, I stopped asking questions out loud. Instead, I started paying attention. It is amazing what people reveal when they believe you are no longer paying attention. The changes had not happened all at once. Looking back, I could see them stretching across years like small cracks spreading through a window. Each one seemed insignificant by itself. Together, they told a different story. Ryan used to call every Sunday afternoon without fail. Even after he got married, he kept the habit for a while. Then the calls became every other week, then once a month. Eventually, they arrived only when he needed information, advice, or a favor. I told myself that life was busy. Successful careers demand time. Families grow. Responsibilities multiply. Those explanations sounded reasonable until I noticed that he always seemed to have time for everyone except me. A few weeks after the conversation on the patio, I was not invited to Emma's school awards ceremony. I learned about it from a photograph online. Emma stood smiling beside a banner, while Ryan and Vanessa stood proudly on either side of her. I stared at the picture longer than I should have. Not because I wanted to be in it, because nobody had thought to tell me it was happening. The following month brought another small surprise. Ryan called to inform me that they would be spending Christmas morning at Vanessa's parents' house. His tone suggested the decision had already been made long ago. I wished them a wonderful holiday and hung up. Then I sat quietly in my living room, looking at the Christmas tree I had already decorated. The ornaments shimmered beneath the lights. Many of them were handmade. Ryan had created some in elementary school. I could still see traces of glue and uneven paint beneath the years. I wondered if he remembered making them. I wondered if he remembered anything at all. As spring turned into summer, more pieces fell into place. Family group messages would mention gatherings after they happened. Plans were discussed without including me. Decisions were announced rather than shared. Nobody was openly cruel. That was what made it so difficult to explain. There were no dramatic arguments. No slammed doors. No harsh words. Just a steady pattern of exclusion disguised as convenience. One afternoon, Emma stopped by after school. She was 16 then, tall and thoughtful, with Ryan's eyes and my habit of observing before speaking. We sat on the back porch drinking lemonade while cicadas buzzed in the distance. She seemed distracted. Finally, she looked down at her glass. "Grandma," she asked carefully, "did Dad tell you about the lake trip?" I smiled gently. "What lake trip?" The color drained from her face. She immediately realized what she had done. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, "I thought you knew." Those 4 words stayed with me long after she left, because by then, I was beginning to understand something painful. I was not being forgotten. Forgetting is accidental. This felt deliberate, and the more I paid attention, the more I began to suspect that someone had been quietly rewriting my place in the family for a very long time. The lake trip was only the beginning. Once I started noticing the gaps, I could not stop seeing them. A week after Emma's visit, I opened social media and found photographs from a long weekend at a resort 2 hours away. Ryan was there. Vanessa was there. Emma was there. Even Vanessa's parents were there. They were smiling beside a lakeside restaurant, holding ice cream cones, sitting around a fire pit as the sun went down. I studied each picture carefully, not because I wanted proof that I had been excluded, because I wanted to understand when my family had become a group that operated without me. The answer was unsettling. It had happened gradually, so gradually that nobody ever had to explain it. A few days later, Ryan called. His voice sounded cheerful. He talked about work, traffic, and a home improvement project. For nearly 20 minutes, He chatted as though everything was perfectly normal. Not once did he mention the trip. Not once did he ask whether I had seen the photographs. When the conversation ended, I sat quietly at my kitchen table. The same table where Ryan had done his homework as a boy. The same table where we celebrated birthdays, graduations, and holidays. I ran my fingers along a small scratch in the wood. Ryan had made it accidentally when he was 12 and trying to assemble a model airplane. I remembered how upset he had been. I remembered telling him that some marks become part of a family's story. Looking back, I realized that the table remembered more than my son did. As summer moved on, I began keeping a small notebook beside my chair in the living room. Whenever something felt strange, I wrote it down. Dates, conversations, events. Nothing dramatic, just observations. A canceled invitation. A gathering I learned about afterward. A decision announced without discussion. The notebook grew thicker than I expected. One afternoon, Emma visited again. She seemed nervous. After helping me water the flowers on the porch, she sat beside me on the swing and stared out at the yard. Finally, she spoke. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Of course." She hesitated. "Why do you always find out about things last?" The question landed harder than any accusation could have, because it came from someone honest enough to notice what everyone else pretended not to see. I chose my words carefully. Sometimes people convince themselves that excluding someone is easier than including them. Emma looked down. "Mom says you prefer being alone." I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Clarity. I had never said that. Not once. Suddenly, dozens of moments rearranged themselves in my memory. Invitations that never arrived. Plans that vanished. Explanations that never quite made sense. For the first time, I began wondering how many messages had been filtered before reaching me. How many conversations had been shaped before I ever heard them. Emma remained silent for a moment before speaking again. "I do not think that is true." Neither did I. And as the sun lowered behind the trees and shadows stretched across the lawn, I realized that someone had been carefully controlling the story my family heard about me. The question was no longer whether it was happening. The question was who had started it and how far it had gone. After my conversation with Emma, I stopped looking for explanations and started looking for patterns. There is a difference. Explanations comfort us. Patterns reveal us. Every morning, I sat in the same chair by the living room window with a cup of coffee and my notebook. The pages were filling faster now, not because people were treating me differently, but because I had finally stopped dismissing what I saw. One Saturday afternoon, Ryan called unexpectedly. He sounded unusually cheerful. "We are having everyone over next weekend," he said. "You should come." For a moment, I almost felt relieved. Then something caught my attention. "Everyone?" I asked. "Of course," he replied. "The whole family." After we hung up, I smiled to myself. The invitation sounded normal. Thoughtful, even. Yet 3 days later, Emma called. She wanted help choosing a dress for an event. During the conversation, she casually mentioned a large family barbecue that had taken place the previous weekend at Vanessa's parents' house. Nearly 30 people had attended. Ryan had been there. Vanessa had been there. Several cousins had been there. I had not even known it existed. When I ended the call, I did not feel shocked anymore. That surprised me. The hurt was still there, but it had changed shape. It was becoming understanding. The following week, I attended the gathering Ryan had invited me to. The moment I arrived, I noticed something strange. Conversations stopped briefly. Not dramatically, just long enough to be noticeable. Then smiles appeared. Polite smiles. Careful smiles. Vanessa greeted me warmly. Too warmly. She wrapped her arms around me and asked how I had been. A few minutes later, while standing near the patio, I overheard a distant relative say something that made my stomach tighten. "You seem much happier these days, Helen. I am glad you finally decided to be more involved." I stared at her. "More involved?" She nodded. "Vanessa told us you usually prefer staying home and avoiding family events." Suddenly, several pieces clicked together. Not loudly, quietly, like puzzle pieces finding their place. I thought about Emma's comment. I thought about the missing invitations, the forgotten gatherings, the assumptions people seemed to make about me. Nobody believed they were excluding me. They believed they were respecting my wishes. Wishes I had never expressed. For the rest of the afternoon, I listened more than I spoke. By the time I drove home, the sun was setting behind the hills and the sky glowed orange above the highway. My hands rested calmly on the steering wheel. Inside, however, something important had shifted. For months, I had wondered whether I was imagining things, whether loneliness had made me overly sensitive, whether age had made me suspicious. Now I knew better. Someone had been telling a story about me, a story repeated often enough that people accepted it as truth. And the most painful realization was not that strangers believed it. The most painful realization was that Ryan seemed perfectly comfortable letting them believe it too. That realization stayed with me for days. Not because it was shocking anymore, but because it explained so much. Once you understand the story people have been told about you, their behavior suddenly makes sense. The invitations that never came, the assumptions, the awkward smiles. None of it had happened by accident. One afternoon, I decided to test something. Ryan called to tell me about a birthday dinner planned for one of his cousins. Before he could finish, I politely declined. "I think I will stay home," I said. There was a brief pause. Then came something unexpected. Relief. Not from Ryan. From Vanessa. I could hear it in the background. A soft laugh. A quiet comment she probably thought I could not hear. "See? I told you." The words were gone almost as quickly as they appeared. Ryan continued speaking as if nothing had happened. But I heard enough. Later that evening, I opened my notebook and added another entry. Not because I needed proof anymore. Because writing things down helped me see the truth clearly. The truth was that someone had spent years creating a version of me that was easier to exclude. A lonely older woman who preferred being by herself. A mother who disliked social gatherings. A grandmother who was happiest staying home. None of it was true. Yet people accepted it because they heard it often enough. A week later, Emma stopped by again. She carried 2 iced coffees and sat beside me on the porch swing. For several minutes, we watched a squirrel race across the yard. Finally, she spoke. "Grandma, can I tell you something?" I nodded. "Always." She looked uncomfortable. "Mom gets upset when people invite you directly." I turned toward her slowly. "What do you mean?" Emma stared at her coffee cup. "Sometimes Aunt Melissa calls you herself. Sometimes Dad's cousins call you. Whenever that happens, Mom says it makes planning difficult." I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. Not because the information was pleasant, because it confirmed what I already suspected. Emma continued. "Last month, Aunt Melissa wanted you at dinner. Mom told everyone you were tired and did not want to go." I looked out at the backyard. The flower beds needed watering. The roses along the fence had started blooming again. Life continued, even when relationships changed. "Did Aunt Melissa know that?" I asked quietly. Emma shook her head. "She thought you said no." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Emma reached over and squeezed my hand. "I do not think people know what is really happening." Her words stayed with me after she left. That night, I sat alone in my living room surrounded by decades of family photographs. For the first time, I stopped asking whether Vanessa was controlling the narrative. The evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. The harder question was why Ryan allowed it. Because every false story, every missing invitation, every assumption required one thing above all else. His silence. And deep down, I was beginning to fear that silence was not weakness. It was agreement. For several days, I could not stop thinking about that word. Agreement. It lingered in my mind every time I looked at an old photograph or passed an empty chair at my dining table. It would have been easier to blame everything on Vanessa. Easier to imagine that Ryan was simply being manipulated. Mothers are remarkably talented at protecting their children from difficult truths, even after those children become adults. But the evidence no longer supported that comforting version of the story. One Thursday afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call from Melissa. She sounded cheerful at first, but after a few minutes her tone changed. "Helen, I have been meaning to ask you something," she said. "Why did you stop coming to family birthdays?" I closed my eyes. I did not stop coming. There was silence on the other end of the line. "What do you mean?" she asked. I took a slow breath. I was not invited. Another long silence followed. Finally, Melissa spoke. "Vanessa told us you preferred smaller gatherings these days." There it was again. The same story. The same explanation. The same carefully crafted version of me. This time, however, something different happened. Instead of feeling hurt, I felt strangely detached. Almost as though I were observing someone else's life. Melissa and I spoke for nearly an hour. By the end of the conversation, several misunderstandings had been cleared up. More importantly, I realized that family members were beginning to compare notes. Small inconsistencies were becoming visible. People were starting to notice that the explanations never quite matched reality. The following weekend, I attended a cousin's anniversary celebration. It was held at a country club about 30 miles from my house. The ballroom was filled with laughter, music, and familiar faces. As I moved from table to table, I noticed something surprising. Several relatives mentioned invitations they thought I had declined. Others referenced events I had supposedly chosen not to attend. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle. By the end of the evening, one truth stood out above all others. The false image of me had spread much farther than I realized. Yet something even more troubling emerged. Whenever people mentioned these situations, Ryan never corrected them. Not once. He never said, "Actually, my mother wanted to come." He never said, "There may have been a misunderstanding." He simply allowed the assumptions to stand. Driving home that night, I felt a sadness deeper than anger. Because I finally understood the real betrayal. It was not the missing invitations. It was not the rumors. It was not even the plans being made without me. It was watching my son become comfortable with a version of reality that diminished his own mother. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light illuminated the flower beds I had spent years tending. The roses were thriving despite a season of unusually hot weather. I stood there for a moment, looking at them. Then I thought about something my husband used to say. Character is revealed by what people allow, not just by what they do. For the first time, I stopped asking whether Ryan knew what was happening. The harder truth was beginning to take shape. I believed he knew exactly what was happening, and that realization changed everything. The change came faster than I expected. For years, Ryan and Vanessa had appeared untouchable. Their lives seemed perfectly organized from the outside. Beautiful house, successful careers, vacations posted online, smiling family photographs. The kind of life people admire without looking too closely. Then small cracks began appearing. At first, I only heard rumors. A canceled business partnership, unexpected financial pressure, stress at work. Nothing dramatic by itself. But stress has a way of revealing things that comfort can hide. One evening, Emma arrived at my house unexpectedly. She looked exhausted. We sat together at the kitchen table while I prepared tea. After several minutes of silence, she finally spoke. "Things are not good at home." I did not interrupt. She continued staring into her cup. "Mom and Dad argue all the time now." Her voice carried the weariness of someone who had spent too many months pretending everything was fine. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Sometimes people need comfort more than advice. Over the next few weeks, more information surfaced. Ryan stopped calling as often. When he did call, he sounded distracted. The confidence that once filled his voice had faded. Meanwhile, several relatives quietly reached out to me. Not because they wanted gossip, because they were confused. Stories were no longer matching reality. Explanations that once seemed convincing were beginning to unravel. Then came the moment that changed everything. It happened at a family gathering near the end of summer. Nothing unusual was planned. Just a casual afternoon barbecue. I arrived early and spent time helping set tables on the patio. As guests began arriving, I noticed something different. People were talking openly now. Questions that had once remained unasked were finally being spoken aloud. Why had Helen stopped attending family events? Why had invitations gone missing? Why did different people remember the same situations differently? The answers were uncomfortable. Even more uncomfortable was the growing realization that many assumptions had been built on information that was not entirely accurate. Ryan arrived nearly an hour late. The moment I saw him, I knew something had changed. He looked older. Not physically, emotionally. The confidence was gone. The certainty was gone. Throughout the afternoon, he seemed distant and distracted. Several times I caught him watching conversations unfold from across the yard, almost as though he was hearing things differently for the first time. Then something happened that I will never forget. One of his cousins casually mentioned an event from the previous year and joked about how I never wanted to attend family functions. Before I could respond, another relative interrupted. "That is not true. She was never invited." The conversation stopped instantly. Ryan looked up. Several people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Nobody laughed. Nobody changed the subject. For the first time, the story that had protected itself for years was being challenged in public. I watched my son's face carefully. Surprise appeared first, then confusion, then something deeper, recognition. In that moment, I realized he was finally seeing the consequences of years spent looking the other way. And as the afternoon sun began sinking toward the horizon, I had the strange feeling that Ryan was about to lose something far more important than his reputation. He was about to confront the truth about himself. The next time I saw Ryan was in the hospital room, the same room where everything finally came into focus. By then, weeks had passed since the family barbecue. Questions had spread through the family faster than anyone expected. Conversations that had once been avoided were happening openly. People were comparing memories, comparing messages, comparing explanations. The carefully maintained version of events was beginning to collapse under the weight of simple facts. During that time, I spent more hours alone than usual. Not because I felt abandoned. Quite the opposite. For the first time in years, I felt free from the burden of pretending everything was normal. I stopped making excuses for people. I stopped rewriting reality into something easier to accept. One afternoon, I opened an old cedar chest in my bedroom. Inside were decades of memories. School report cards, birthday cards, photographs, drawings Ryan had made as a child. Near the bottom was a folded letter he had written when he was 10 years old. The paper had yellowed with age. In uneven handwriting, he had written that he loved me and would always take care of me. I sat there for a long time holding that letter. Not because I believed promises made by children should last forever, because I remembered the heart behind those words. The sincerity, the kindness, the loyalty. That was the boy I missed, not the man standing in my hospital room months later. When Ryan finally came to visit after the family gathering, he looked exhausted. The confidence that had once protected him was gone. He sat beside my bed and stared at the floor for several moments before speaking. "Mom, I did not realize how bad it had become." I listened quietly. "People have been talking," he continued. "I have been hearing things I never knew." I looked at him carefully. There was genuine regret in his eyes. But regret and responsibility are not the same thing. "You knew enough?" I said gently. He lowered his head. Neither of us spoke for a while. The monitor beside my bed hummed softly. Outside the window, autumn leaves drifted across the parking lot below. Finally, Ryan looked up. I should have paid attention. His voice cracked slightly. I should have asked more questions. For the first time in years, he sounded honest. Not defensive, not distracted. Honest. And that honesty made the moment harder, not easier. Because it confirmed what I had suspected all along. He had seen pieces of the truth. He simply chose not to examine them. Tears filled his eyes. "I am still here, Mom." The room became very quiet. I thought about the little boy with the fishing pole. The teenager who carried groceries without being asked. The young man who once called every Sunday afternoon just to hear my voice. Then I looked at the man sitting beside my hospital bed. A man who had spent years allowing distance, silence, and convenience to replace courage. I smiled sadly. Not with anger. Not with bitterness. Just truth. "No, sweetheart," I said softly. The boy I raised left a long time ago. And for the first time, neither of us looked away.